Then, so island nations, Eastland and Southland. Now, in a question like this, make sure you evaluate the tables, evaluate the data you've been given before you try to solve the problem. So know what you're looking at here. You've got nominal GDP, GDP deflator, and population for two separate island nations. Part A, calculate each of the following for year 2, show your work. So make sure we're working with that bottom row, year 2. Our verb, calculate, we're going to be doing some math here, doing some numbers. Show your work. What show your work means is we've got to explain our final answer by showing how we got there. Think of show your work as the mathematical or computational equivalent to an explain question when you're writing out an answer. All you really have to do is show the equation that gave you your final answer. So, what do we calculate? We're going to calculate real GDP per capita for Eastland. We're going to calculate real GDP per capita for Southland. So, real GDP per capita. What that means here is we're going to have to take 2 steps. We're going to have to first convert nominal into real GDP and then take that real GDP divided by population to get real GDP per capita. So for Eastland first, nominal GDP divided by the deflator. Is going to give us our real when we multiply by 100. That means 230 over 115 times 100 gives us the real GDP. You divide that by 4, and that's going to give you $50 per capita GDP. Do the same thing for Southland. Nominal GDP over GDP deflator, that's 500 over 125. Multiply that by 100 and divide by 4, and that's going to give you a real GDP per capita of $100. Therefore, your real GDP per capita in Eastland is $50 and Southland is $100. Part B, if Eastland and Southland have the same velocity of money in year 2, which nation must have the higher money supply in year 2? Explain. All right, velocity of money, where does that come from? Now that was a unit 5 concept. We relate that to the quantity theory of money. That's where we learn this. We call this also the equation of exchange. That's not used in AP macro, but that's what the term is. That's what the equation is. So the quantity theory of money is going to reference the velocity of money. What was that? That was your MV equals PY, where your money supply times the velocity of money is equal to the price level times real output. Now, another step to that, another stage to that is recalling that P times Y, price level times real output, that's going to give me nominal GDP, and that's going to be important here because that's what I can use to help me solve this problem. So consider that. With that in mind, we can conclude Southland has the higher money supply in year 2. Use that equation. You've got nominal GDP for year 2 for both countries. Since the two nations have the same velocity of money, so V is equal in both of these, Southland has the higher nominal GDP, Southland must have the higher money supply. In other words, P times Y is higher in Southland than it is in Eastland. And with V being the same, M must be greater in Southland. Use the equation. It is a tool, and it's a tool that's supposed to help you understand the concept. Use it. That's what it's for. Part C, Southland produces consumer goods and capital goods. While maintaining full employment, Southland decides to allocate fewer resources to the production of consumer goods. What will be the effect on the long-run economic growth rate in Southland? Explain. There's my verb again. So, they're going to maintain full employment. I read this, and I start thinking PPC. I'm going to draw PPC off to the side, and I'm going to think about what happens while they maintain full employment. What happens with that reallocation of resources and the reallocation of production, and then how that's going to impact the economic growth rate. So maybe start there and work backwards. What causes a change in the economic growth rate? It's a big topic, especially in Unit 5. The economic growth rate changes because of changes in productivity. Okay, take another step backwards. Productivity changes due to capital formation. There's your link to the question that we're working on right here. We had this adjustment. They're going to allocate fewer resources to the production of consumer goods. Well, on the flip side, that means they're allocating more resources to the production of capital goods. With the allocation of production towards capital goods, you get that capital formation, you get those increases in productivity, and you get an increase in the long-run economic growth rate in Southland. And that's exactly how we want to explain it. By allocating fewer resources to the production of consumer goods, capital formation will increase, leading to a greater future production and consumption. And that's what we're talking about here. All right, new question, number 2. Greenberg's economy is in short-run equilibrium with an inflationary gap of $48 billion, and the marginal propensity to save is 0.25. The expected inflation rate is 8%, the natural rate of unemployment is 7%. There's a lot of data being thrown at you here in that introduction. I'm jotting it down to the side. I want to know what they just told me, and I want to kind of keep it all straight. Great, so start here. You got an inflationary gap. Output is beyond full employment. Based on the Phillips curve model, that's Unit 5, so that's where we are now, is the actual inflation rate greater than, less than, or equal to the expected inflation rate of 8% in Greenberg? Explain. So really, we have a multiple choice question based on the Phillips curve. We've got to select greater than, less than, or equal to, and then we have to explain how we got our answer. So, the expected inflation rate was 8%. Our natural rate of unemployment is 7%. We can show these on our Phillips curve. Now let's make a mental note here. The question didn't ask you to draw it. You don't have to draw the graph here. You can. You can draw it as part of your explanation. I'm going to draw it just to help me solve the problem. I want to see it. I need the visual. So I'm going to draw this off to the side to sketch it out so I can visualize what's going on. So here's my Phillips curve, long run and short run Phillips curve. I've got my expected inflation rate, my natural rate of unemployment, which they stated here were 8% and 7% respectively. But now I've got an inflationary gap. So what I'm showing here is not our current situation. Our current situation looks like this, where we're dealing with an inflationary gap, which means unemployment is less than the natural rate, and as a result, our current inflation rate is higher than expected. And that's the answer to the question. The actual inflation rate is greater than the expected inflation rate. How do I explain that? With an inflationary gap, the actual unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment, or you could say short-run equilibrium is to the left of long-run Phillips curve. And you can use the graph in your explanation. You can draw a graph. You don't have to. It didn't tell you to, but you can. That is acceptable.
Shoelace Learning is a game-based learning platform that delivers reading comprehension content through video games kids love to play. And
Part B. Assume the government takes no policy action with regard to the state of Greenberg's economy. Okay, so the government's going to sit this one out for now. What are they asking? Connect that to a concept. That concept is long-run self-adjustment. We learned that all the way back in Unit 3. So we have an inflationary gap. And what the question really is saying is, how do we explain that long-run self-adjustment process, and what does it do to the actual rate of unemployment in the long run? Actual rate of unemployment is going to increase. Now, how do we explain why that is? Inflationary expectations, you have options here. Inflationary expectations, nominal wages, input prices, all of these are going to increase. Remember, we're operating beyond full employment. Resources are all inflation. Sit this one out. No, draw a graph. You don't have to. It didn't tell you to, but you can. That is acceptable. Part B. Assume the government takes no policy action with regard to the state of Greenberg's economy. Okay, so the government's going to sit this one out for now. What are they asking you? Connect that to a concept. That inflation in that long run is inflationary expectations. You have options here. Inflationary expectations, nominal wages, input prices, all of these are going to increase. Remember, we're operating beyond full employment. Resources are being depleted. Everybody's grasping for the same ones. Workers are expecting inflation. They know that they've got a tight labor market. They can push up wages. They can demand higher wages because just about everybody who wants a job has a job. For all these reasons, resource prices start to go up. And as a result, SRAS just left. And it's going to do so until real output decreases back to potential output, back to full employment output. That in itself is causing the actual rate of unemployment to increase. And remember, it's just increasing back to the natural rate. It was below the natural rate, now it's going back to the natural rate. Part B2, how would a long-run adjustment process be represented in the Phillips curve model? Explain. So they're asking you to verbally explain what happens in the Phillips curve. You don't have to draw it, but you can. Just know if you draw it, you've also got to verbalize what happened. So here we are. We did this in our notes earlier, right? We're operating with an inflationary gap, unemployment less than the natural rate. As inflationary expectations go up, in other words, as that high inflation rate becomes the expectation, we're going to see that short-run Phillips curve shift out to the right. And we're going to establish a new long-run equilibrium further out at a higher rate of inflation. What does that mean? The answer to the question is the short-run Phillips curve will shift to the right. And explaining, again, almost the same explanation we just said, inflationary expectations, nominal wages, input prices will increase. This causes the short-run Phillips curve to shift to the right, again, until actual unemployment is equal to the natural rate. There's a new expected inflation rate, and that's what causes that short-run Phillips curve to shift right. Back of your mind, keep this in mind. For any given short-run Phillips curve, there is only one expected inflation rate. When it changes, the curve shifts.
YouTube Music is a music app, and with Music Premium, it's like a force field letting you play over 80 million official.
All right, part C. Assume instead of waiting for long-run adjustment, the government of Greenberg is considering using fiscal policy to address the inflationary gap of $48 billion. So we still have an inflationary gap. They're going to use fiscal policy. If the government chooses to decrease deficit spending, calculate the minimum change in government spending required to decrease aggregate demand by the amount of the inflationary gap. Show your work. So there's my verb, calculate. I got to calculate something. I've got an MPC of 0.25. This is a multiplier question. Anytime you see MPC, your brain should just go ahead and go there. There's probably a multiplier coming. Maybe not 100%, but probably so. As a reminder, this is how we use the multiplier. We've got to find the multiplier first, and we've got to determine the desired change in aggregate demand. So in our equation, which we have to show, I'm going to say the change, the desired change in aggregate demand divided by the spending multiplier is going to give me my answer. With a $48 billion inflationary gap, they're looking to decrease aggregate demand by $48 billion. So that goes in our numerator. Our spending multiplier is 1 over the MPC, or I'm sorry, 1 over MPS, 0.25. That's 4. Our negative $48 billion desired change divided by 4 is going to give you negative $12 billion. Our answer is a $12 billion decrease in government spending. How will the effect of the government action in Part CI be represented in the Phillips curve model? Explain. So now we're thinking about movement along versus shift of the Phillips curve. In our previous question involving the Phillips curve, we had a shift. because that was short run aggregate supply and it was reflecting that. Here, we have movement along. Fiscal policy is going to involve a shift of aggregate demand. When aggregate demand changes, we're going to move along the short run Phillips curve. So in this particular case, we have a contractionary fiscal policy. AD is shifting left. That leftward shift of aggregate demand is decreasing output. It's going to decrease employment, which increases unemployment. It's also going to decrease price levels, so we can anticipate a decrease in inflation. That's movement down along to the right on the SRPC. The government's decrease in spending will be represented by movement down the short run Phillips curve. And I'm talking down to the right. Think of it as like southeast. To explain that, again, connect that back to aggregate demand. The decrease in government spending will decrease aggregate demand, which will decrease real output, increase unemployment, and decrease price levels. C3, if the government chooses to increase income taxes instead of decreasing its spending, calculate the minimum change in income taxes required to decrease AD by the amount of the inflationary gap. Show your work, as always. So, we still have an NPS of 0.25. We know it's a multiplier question. We need to know the multiplier. This time it's a tax multiplier. And we need to know the desired change in AD. We're going to show our work as we always do on calculation questions. So we have desired change in AD over the tax multiplier, not the spending, the tax multiplier. Our desired change in AD is still negative 48 billion. We're trying to close that inflationary gap. Our tax multiplier is negative NPC over NPS. That's going to give us negative 48 billion over negative 3, and that's going to give us $16 billion. Okay, it's a positive number because a negative over a negative gives us positive, but also because you would need to increase taxes to decrease spending and therefore decrease aggregate demand. So, increase of $16 billion. C4. Now, suppose instead that the government wants to maintain a balanced budget and increases both government spending and income taxes by $40 billion. Will this policy make the output gap smaller, make the output gap larger, or have no effect on the output gap? Explain. Again, it's a multiple choice question with an explanation. Work your way through this one at a time. It might be the easiest way to do it. Now, there is the balanced budget multiplier. We can discuss that as well, but first, just work your way through it one at a time. When they increase spending by 40 billion, that 40 billion times a multiplier of 4 is going to cause output to go up by 160 billion. When they increase taxes by the same 40 billion, because of our negative 3 tax multiplier, that's going to decrease output by 120 billion. When we combine those two, we're going to see a $40 billion increase in output. Notice, when taxes and spending change by the same amount, the change in output will be that amount. We call that the result of the balanced budget multiplier. As a result, output is increasing by $40 billion. Now, they didn't ask us to calculate it, but by calculating it, I can get to the correct answer. The policy is going to make the output gap larger. You had a $48 billion inflationary gap, and now you're adding another $40 billion. A way to explain that? An equal increase in government spending and income taxes will result in an increase in real GDP. Remember, the spending multiplier is always greater than the tax multiplier. The spending will have a greater impact than the change in taxes. Okay, that does it for this session. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got a lot